ripping the planet a new poppermost. Whew.
Twister.
This is Beatles60.
This is Beatles60. We ain't jumping around. I'm Andy, and he's Larry. Thanks for listening. We've got a really big shoe today.
This is our comprehensive first look back a couple of years and then forward a year to have our minds pre-blown by the rapid sudden mania that'll have taken over Britain 60 years ago very soon. After all the stress of their wondering why for so long they still weren't getting recognized beyond their local corner of England, the Northwest, they still haven't had a number one hit, and they were determined to reach that level and finally break nationally. Well, spoiler alert. Spoilers. They're about to break through. In 1963, things happen that, well, you know how in folklore, March comes in like a lion and goes out like a lamb?
Yeah?
I wish there was some kind of neat set of metaphors for that, for the year 1963. I mean, for Britain and the Fab Four, it comes in as literally an Arctic winter, but otherwise business as usual for our boys. And 1963 will end in, what metaphor is there for mass hysteria? The intensity of our story just escalates exponentially to the point where they make history within the span of this new year. They are the front page. Andy, maybe you can explain better how amazing this year will become.
Yeah, well, we've been talking all year about, or all last year, about how important 1962 was, and it was, of course. But it was still a prologue. 1963 is going to be singularly important in the career of the Beatles. UK Beatlemania, a mania unlike anything anyone in the nation had ever dreamt of, let alone experienced. The mania is on its way, and by the end of the year, that Beatlemania will begin to be ready to burst worldwide. So we feel like we really need to preview what's going to happen this year. And you'll really want to hear this to get a preview of how the Beatles will ascend to a level that no one, including them, were aware even existed. After this month, we're going to watch it happen month by month, almost like in real time.
There's this kind of fascinating disconnect we know we're going to witness 60 years ago soon. A disconnect between their daily ordinary workaday Beatle work, even when they suddenly become the front page almost daily. They somehow remain themselves all through it.
Oh, think of it like people who are kind of on a rocket launch, right? It's a phenomenally fast takeoff. But not only is the rocket accelerating, the amount of acceleration itself is increasing. Does that make sense?
How about a rocket that's accelerating and cloning itself over and over 24/7? No, there are no words.
None.
Okay, now from Indra to Ed, you ready?
All set. We'll be talking about two pivots in the Beatles story. Gradually, in 1962, an era ended. David made some great observations about this. Before Brian, they were a leather-clad rock and roll band who played the clubs in Liverpool and Hamburg. Pete was drumming. They were still eating, smoking, and swearing on stage. And then, pivot number one.
Pivot one.
Now, 60 years ago, they'd been combing their hair forward for a year and a couple months. Brian had been on board for over a year, and now they were in suits, writing their own songs, choosing more contemporary soul music to play and eventually pop music, appearing on radio and TV. Ringo was drumming, and they had to start getting used to becoming a studio band. Pivot number 2.
Pivot 2.
Around 10 months from now, they will become the front page.
Yeah, I mean, it's unheard of. Nobody could have expected that that a pop group from the North would become the main story of the year, you know?
Yeah.
And it just continues like that. In hindsight, it seems normal to us now, but damn, it must have been quite a time. People from there and then seem to remember that the newspapers in the latter part of the year became filled with both the government sex scandal, the Profumo scandal, and the Beatles appearing in their pages more and more and more until both topics became ubiquitous and sometimes front page. But now let's go back.
Can you make some rewind sounds?
Andy, you've been following this story every day for a few years now, going back to Quarryman days, sharing something almost every day on social media. I'm not sure whether newer listeners understand that there's a method to our madness.
There is. When I first debuted what was then called Barmy Old Codger on July 6th, 2017, a fairly important 60th anniversary, you know, the day John and Paul met. Right? The idea was to celebrate the dates when songs written by the Beatles came into existence 60 years later. After a while, I changed the whole mission to kind of just tell the story of the Beatles chronologically, day by day, 60 years later. The fact that you could follow in their footsteps exactly 60 years later was key.
Some people cool. Some people.
And without knowing you or your project at the time, 2.5 years ago, I started a Facebook group with Grant Heaton, doing the same daily chronicle, starting just after they named themselves Beatles with an A, just after Pete joined, and they were a 5-piece with Stu on bass. Our first post was 60 years to the day after Alan Williams and Lord Woodbine drove them to play at the Indra, August 1960. Day 2 was their first night in Hamburg. 2.5 years later, now, John, Paul, George, and Ringo played their last residency in Hamburg. They wouldn't return until the 1966 tour.
2 shows.
Almost all of us have heard the famous audio recording of those last nights at the Star Club at the end of 62. I think Torsten Kluplach said it was often on recordings of all the different groups starting on December 24th and lasting to the end of the year.
Yeah.
The recording itself is low quality, but the band sounds loud, tight, energized, and dynamic. I mean, it's a hot performance even by today's standards. Good PA, good drum kit, good amps. So, Indra 1960 and the Star Club 1962 are like bookends. My question is, what must they have sounded like a couple of years back at the Indra compared with their sound and skill now, well into the new year, at the start of 1963? I mean, from mid-1960 at the Indra and the Kaiserkeller to early 61, back home at the Casbah Club, Litherland, and so on. For example, wasn't Paul's cheap guitar strung with piano strings and not even plugged in?
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah.
I suppose their charm, their attitude, vocals, and beat wowed people regardless of the equipment. But in 1960, wouldn't it have seemed unlikely that these young guys, this ragtag group, would eventually dominate the global culture of the decade?
Yeah, they were just a club band like so many others. They became a good one, for sure, and one that won people over with their personalities and humor. But did that mean they could become iconic? I think that we can say with confidence that their various transformational steps in 1962 really did end that first era of Beatles history and made way for a new one. Leather became suits. Swearing, eating, and smoking on stage became bows. Pete became Ringo. Okay, that's not quite the right visual, but you know what I mean. Their rock and roll was beginning to see pop music find its way in. The Beatles for years now had been all about live performances. Now they were increasingly on radio and TV while becoming studio musicians, and John and Paul were becoming serious songwriters.
The Beatles are dead. Long live the Fab Four.
Ha! And what happened next was beyond expectations.
This is Beatles60.
This was only part of a longer audio podcast. You can find one or two other parts of this episode on our YouTube channel. We post audio to YouTube only in short segments to make them easy to share. If your purpose is to share short segments of our audio podcast, then the YouTube clips can be convenient, but our YouTube channel is just for segments. It's audio, so there's nothing to look at. We're not really interested in producing video content. So, for Beatles60, to tell you the truth, the YouTube channel is really where the action isn't. If you want a continuous listening experience for yourself while washing up or while hiking or while commuting, similar to listening to audiobooks, then we recommend getting our full podcast episodes automatically sent to your phone or your tablet or your PC every month. Use a podcast app. It's easy to find us and subscribe. There's a link in the show notes, or you can always go to Beatles60.group. You see, you navigate down to one of the episode pictures on the front page, and then you tap that, and then there's a description of the episode, and then listen now, and then you tap that, and you can choose any podcast app that works for you. Or you could listen right there if you want to.
This is Beatles60.
The interval between this podcast and our next podcast will, 60 years ago, have been the exact same interval.
Get the idea? The Beatles will have experienced the exact same number of days, same season. All of you who have been following this real-time chronicle with us already get the pace.
You already understand, right? Same speed. Technically, we'd call this a longitudinal phenomenological...
Hey!
historiographic study.
Larry.
Eh?
What's with all the academic jargon?
Well, this is a serious series. The Earth turns at one speed and in one way, am I right? At least in lived experience, last I looked. Now remember, the future is unwritten.
Ultimately, we're talking about human experience. We can't walk in the Beatles' boots if we're jumping around all different billions and billions of years. As nothing could make any sense.
So come on, we gotta repeat that slogan. This is a chronicle.
Beatles60, we ain't jumping around.